I'm Dr. Joanna Wozniak-Brown, the Assistant Director of Resilience Planning at CIRCA, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the final event of our webinars of climate change and public health. Our panel today is Nicholas Elton, graduate student at Yale School of Public Health, and Michelle DeLuca, the Deputy Emergency Management Director at the City of Norwalk. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please post them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end. As a reminder, you'll be able to access a recording of this webinar on our YouTube page following the event. Nick will start the presentations by reviewing a recent survey he worked on with CIRCA and the Connecticut Department of Public Health. Take it away, Nick.
All right, thanks, Joanna, for having me and for giving me this opportunity to present on this. I'll be giving an overview of the survey we worked on this summer of cooling centers and emergency shelters in Connecticut. But before I jump into the actual survey, I think it's important to understand why cooling centers and emergency shelters are important and helpful. Let's see. So in the northeastern region of the United States, emergency events such as extreme weather events are projected to increase in duration, frequency, and intensity due to climate change. What this means for Connecticut is that coastal cities and towns will be heavily affected by hurricanes, precipitation events, and flooding, which we saw quite a bit this past summer. Also, inland cities and towns will be affected by tornadoes and a variety of other weather events. There are also other emergency events that can warrant an emergency shelter opening, such as chemical spills or power outages. And then, although it's not a prominent problem here in Connecticut, but as we see out in the West Coast, wildfires and air pollution are some additional events that we need to take into consideration. So along with emergency weather events, there's also extreme heat, which is also projected to increase in frequency, duration, and intensity due to climate change. This is important because extreme heat causes and exacerbates heat-related illnesses such as heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat cramps, and heat rash, as well as a number of related symptoms that go along with those. So cooling centers are important for the prevention of heat-related illness. And what cooling centers are air-conditioned buildings that are available to the public and are a designated safe space from extreme heat. These are especially important for vulnerable populations that do not have air conditioning or have limited air conditioning. Some of these vulnerable populations include the elderly, low-income populations, minority populations, outdoor workers, people with pre-existing medical conditions, including mental health conditions, and homeless populations. If you're interested in learning more about heat and public health, Dr. Mariana Fragamenti had a great presentation on this topic earlier in this webinar series, and that can also be found online. So then moving on to emergency shelters. These are facilities that provide refuge during limited duration emergency events, such as any of the extreme weather events I mentioned earlier, or other disasters that can happen. Emergency shelters are important because they're also targeting and preventing related illnesses due to these disasters or any discomfort that they can cause, and they're targeted at these vulnerable populations. Dr. Mark Mitchell also gave a great presentation earlier in this webinar series that overviews environmental justice and why it's important that we are addressing these vulnerable populations. So now moving on to the actual survey. This has been a partnership survey that I had the pleasure of working on this summer with Laura Hayes and Joanna Wozniak-Brown. Laura Hayes is with the Department of Public Health and Joanna's with CIRCA. So why did we do this survey? It started with a 2011 Connecticut Climate Change Preparedness Plan that put forth a recommendation for developing best management practices for cooling centers. And then we wanted to develop a survey to gather statewide information about cooling centers. And then we also added emergency shelters just to broaden that range and gather as much information as possible. That's because not a lot of information is available on cooling stations or cooling centers and emergency shelters, or it's not publicly available. So we want to gather as much information as possible. The survey we developed was inspired by a 2017 paper from New York State by Seema Nayak et al. That gave a survey of all cooling centers in New York State and also cooling center features that went along with it. So another overall goal of ours is to inform policies, programs, and plans for climate adaptation that involves cooling centers and emergency shelters. And then for myself, being a public health student, and also a more public health oriented goal, we want to help prevent heat-related illness among different vulnerable populations. So getting into the actual survey more, this was a statewide survey that was targeted at local emergency management directors, local health directors, and regional directors. In total, there's about 250 contacts that we sent it out to. And then we aim to reach all local towns and municipalities in Connecticut, which I believe there's 169, so it's quite a bit. The survey we developed on Qualtrics, which is an online survey platform that made developing survey questions and answers quite simple and easy, as well as being able to get the responses back in an orderly and organized fashion. The survey was sent out via email on September 2nd, and we plan to have it open for a month, so it will be closing on October 2nd, which is a week from this Friday. So what this survey was doing was gathering information about cooling centers and emergency shelters, such as the location of each cooling center and emergency shelter, the hours of operation, some available features, such as if it has ADA access, translation services, public bathrooms, electrical outlets, overnight stay, publicly available water, and other features. We also asked about advertising strategy, so what they do to get out the word of the opening of an emergency shelter or a cooling center. So if it's put on public or social media, newspaper, TV, radio, that kind of things. And then we also want to know who's involved with the organization and management of cooling centers. Throughout the United States, cooling centers are managed differently by different organizations, different government organizations, different nonprofit organizations. So in Connecticut, we kind of wanted to see who manages them and who's involved in the organization and the staffing of cooling centers and emergency shelters. And then under what circumstances do these cooling centers and emergency shelters open? Do they open case by case, or is it under certain defined conditions? And then what is the outreach and accessibility of these cooling centers? Like, do they go out and target vulnerable populations? Do they engage in communities? And who is just involved in reaching out, or do they just put out for the public and have them worry about who's going to see that? And then, is there any involvement in any emergency preparedness plans, either at local levels, regional levels, or state levels, that involve information about cooling centers and emergency shelters? So kind of moving forward with our survey, like I said, it's still in the process of getting responses from the different contexts we send them out to. What we want to do is we want to create a summary report, kind of like what this 2017 paper from New York State did. As you can see, there's a GIS map, layers with the different counties or regions in New York State, as well as where the cooling centers are. So what we want to do is we also want to create a GIS map layer with cooling centers and emergency shelters, as well as the features available for each one. And then we also want, and currently further informing the GC3 work on emergency shelters and cooling center recommendations. What we also want to do is inform Resilient Connecticut project planning. And so based on the responses we've gotten so far, just a little information about it. We have many emergency shelters that have backup power, but fewer of them accept pets or provide transportation. And then we have many respondents that have participated in natural hazard mitigation plans, but fewer have participated in long-range transportation plans. And also more respondents so far do not have any extreme heat response plan than do have one so far. So that's just a little bit about what's going on with our survey this far. So thanks for listening. If you have any questions, we're taking questions at the end, but also feel free to contact me. Put my email up on this slide. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate sharing that. Next, we're going to hear from Michelle DeLuca, the Deputy Emergency Management Director with the City of Norwalk, about ways that climate change factors into emergency management.
Great, thank you. Let me just get to share my screen. Hold on a quick second. All right, so again, thank you for this opportunity. As part of the extreme heat and severe weather events, we've really been looking at the local level, just really where emergency management falls in with some of the planning and climate change. So what we'll look at today is some of the hazards that we kind of plan around, how local municipalities can implement some changes, and then again, kind of the going forward of, how do we adjust our plans, exercises to meet some of the needs of our residents as we move forward with this. And I'll also touch on a survey we did in Region 1 in 2019 for the emergency managers and some others, specifically on climate change and disaster response, and what some of the priorities were that they reported. So for today, I think really, again, because of the time, we'll focus a little bit more on the preparedness and the mitigation aspects of emergency management. As we know, climate change impacts in the Northeast do impact environmental, social, economic systems, and really do impact our most vulnerable residents a lot more severely. And we know that public and private infrastructure, such as utilities, will be increasingly compromised by climate-related hazards. And again, many of us who experienced Tropical Storm Isaias a few weeks ago know the impact of power outages, and again, getting our residents back up and running, businesses, and the impact of a long-term power outage in the community. Oops. Computer's a little bit oversensitive today. So again, for the most part, a lot of the emergency plans from at the local level and even at the regional level take a more all hazards approach. So again, planning for a wide variety of disasters. So even though climate change may not be specifically addressed in emergency plans, what we really do have to start considering is, again, maybe we need to change that approach. So the all hazards plan does work, but again, as changing climate and more intense and frequent weather patterns occur, we may actually have to start looking at maybe different annexes or new planning and mitigation actions to incorporate into the plans. While again, we can't control weather events, we can't control how it impacts the people it hits and how it impacts our residents by changing policies and using more resources to prepare. Many of you may know the FEMA approach of or community-wide planning. And I think, again, for us with climate change as well, we really have to look at all the areas in the community that climate change and severe weather events, including heat, will affect, and making sure that they're at the table. So infrastructure, utilities, education, public health, and even some of the non-traditional partners really need to be more involved as stakeholders if they're not already. For a lot of the part, and I think we all do it, we always look backwards. So we tend to look at, the 1938 hurricane and all the severe weather through history and what happened in the past. And I think really that acknowledgement that the trends are changing. So we have to start looking ahead and really start basing our plans, again, response, mitigation, preparedness, on more current records. So really, again, looking forward a lot more, again, maybe looking at a 5 to 10 year period versus really, again, a long history of disasters. Because again, we know that the change is happening more often, more frequent events, more severe events. So really, again, not looking backwards too much and start looking at, again, the current records and moving forward. And climate change alters hazards. And we often see, again, whether it's multiple storms, oftentimes in climate change or again, the severe weather events that we're seeing can often trap people into a cycle of recovery. So again, they work with their insurance company, they do some mitigation, they get impacted again, and it just seems to be a never-ending cycle, both for residents and at the municipal level. So we never seem to fully get ahead of the storms anymore. And then we also have to look at how government at the local level and other levels are spending money before the storms hit. So we know there's increased costs for cleanup, but then also looking at better building codes and restrictions in vulnerable areas. So again, the economic impact of some of these severe weather events and climate really do affect our bottom line as a municipality. And we have to, again, I think, spend money smarter and start budgeting a little bit smarter. And again, as we saw with the extreme heat, so again, as we have the higher temperatures, often that can cause power outages that then leads, again, the domino effect of impacts for residents. So we know with, again, climate, we often see, again, multiple disasters happening at the same time. And like I mentioned with ECAS a few weeks ago and even over the summer, it just really seems to be a domino effect that we have to start planning for a little bit more often. And then also the impacts of multiple disasters happening at the same time. So again, right now we're seeing the impact of COVID on response plans. So that it definitely over the summer impacted, do we open a shelter or not? Do we open a cooling center? When ECAS affected us, we really had the hard conversations of, do we do mobile feeding? Do we open the overnight disaster shelters? Do we open shower facilities? Because it was weighing that risk of, with the health department, of the COVID exposure versus the power outages and the storm response. So I think, again, as we move forward, we really have to start looking at, how multiple disasters happening at the same time impact our planning. I did want to touch on flooding and sea level rise a little bit. We know that blue sky flooding and urban flooding do happen a little bit more often. Again, very high tide. We are seeing, again, very often cars driving through flooded waters, despite multiple barricades, police presence, DPW barrels, you name it, we can have it blocking off flooded segments of road. And very often we start seeing cars driving through floodwaters and getting stuck and requiring additional responders to go out and perform rescues. So again, flooding is an issue. Sea level rise, what we're also seeing, and when we start looking at some of our flooding maps and some of the projections for the years ahead, areas that are accessible now, there is concern about those areas becoming isolated because access roads may be underwater. So in Norwalk, we have a whole neighborhood community, probably 60, 70 houses, accessible only by a single road. Right now, it's passable. In flood conditions, it becomes isolated. But we know that with sea level rise and with, again, more severe flooding, that road is going to be inaccessible or cut off much earlier. And then we have to really look at how we do evacuation. Do we start earlier? How do we communicate more effectively so that those residents understand that, again, public safety resources will not be able to assist them during a storm, and now that window period may be even longer because they're cut off for longer. So it definitely is interesting when you start looking at the map and the projections for sea level rise. Again, what areas are going to be impacted, what bridges, what access roads will be most impacted, and then how, as emergency management, we start looking ahead and start planning for the impact of residents, and again, especially the impact of evacuation. A few ways that municipalities can prepare, and again, as I tend to go the no cost route, and oftentimes I like to make sure that when we are doing any kind of programs, we're looking at no cost, low cost, and then the higher cost options, so that there are a variety of options. So when we look at mitigation and preparedness, some of the programs that we've done in the past that are no cost really focus on the education, letting residents know, again, as the storm seasons come through, what to expect, how to prepare. A big piece for us is really the expectation management. So being able to say, if you're going to be without power, you may have to be without power for multiple days. Are you prepared for that? And then also the things that we can change, although it does take some time, is ordinance and zoning updates and restrictions. So again, as part of the planning process, it's always that review of, are there ordinance and zoning requirements that may need to be changed to accommodate for some of the sea level rise and extreme heat and some of the other disasters that we're seeing a bit more frequently. Low costs, again, we've looked at a few options that, again, can have a big bang for the buck without costing too much. One thing we are considering, and it is taking some time, is being able to let people know if they're in an evacuation zone by putting reflective collars on stop signs. So at key intersections in different areas, it's a very easy visual way for us to say during a disaster or extreme weather event, if you're in a red zone, evacuate now and look for the collar on the stop sign. Because what we find is, even though hurricanes and some of the other extreme weather events don't happen every year, thank goodness, people do tend to forget that they're in a flood zone or when they have to evacuate. So trying to make it very easy in a visual way so people do know, as people move out, more people come in that don't have a history, it's an easy way to let them know that they may have to evacuate. Low-cost options might be providing assistance for generators for senior facilities and other programs, so they can stay in, maybe operate as a cooling center at their own facility, so they don't have to evacuate to a high school as a cooling center. So the more we can get those generators into the community, the more effective it is for sheltering, comfort stations, response areas, again, cooling centers, warming centers in a disaster. So again, it lets people kind of stay where they are and stay close to home. Again, it doesn't cost a lot of money, but does have a significant impact. And then we also look at homeowner mitigation projects. So if anyone is familiar with FLASH, which is the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, they have a fantastic program for hurricanes and a wide variety of hazards that also provide some information on low cost, no cost homeowner mitigation projects that really anyone can do. So, being able to say, if you buy shelving to get your belongings off the floor in the basement and up to a higher level, that makes a big difference, especially for our low-income residents in vulnerable areas, to protect some of their property. So again, very easy mitigation projects. And then on the higher end, we're looking at always, flood warning systems that can help close roads during severe weather events and rain events. Home elevation projects, there is funding there, but it is a challenge. And again, our low and moderate income homeowners can't always afford to elevate. And then obviously roadway elevation, but really the most effective way for communication and helping residents prepare for extreme weather and then also respond and recover is some of the partnerships. So houses of worship, community sites, community social service programs that really are the trusted voices. So when we provide warnings and information on severe weather events, they can help really spread the word and spread the message. Some of the mitigation challenges that we often face, and I think a lot of municipalities, especially on the coast, do the same or experience the same, is when should residents rebuild after a storm? So during Sandy, it really was difficult to be able to say, should you actually rebuild? Should you elevate? On the one hand, as a municipality, you don't want to lose that tax base, but at some point with repetitive loss, residents do have to figure out, are they going to rebuild? Do they rebuild smarter and higher? So really, again, encouraging folks to make that decision before the disaster and then after, so they know exactly what they're getting into. And again, as a municipality, we have to say, at what point, when the same homes get flooded, every major hurricane or every significant event, should those houses, again, keep rebuilding at the same level or elevation level. One of the big challenges we also have seen is, and if you know the hazard mitigation grant program, That FEMA program allows residents to elevate their homes to base flood elevation plus a foot, which doesn't necessarily allow for sea level rise for the future. So residents want to elevate as much as possible, but they're not provided that funding. So again, we've really looked at trying to encourage FEMA and others to really consider, again, maybe allowing for a little bit more elevation so you do account for sea level rise. And then we also know that financially, not everyone is eligible or able to afford to elevate. Zoning issues, again, is something that we have to look at very hard down here, because we're often seeing what I would call like the McMansions being built on 90+% of the property. So what used to be a very small home with a large yard that could absorb some of the floodwaters, we're now seeing homes that are right next to each other, taking up almost the entire plot of the parcel, because they do want to elevate, they do want to build bigger. So when we do have severe weather events, there really is no way anymore or nowhere for that water to go anymore. One of the most interesting challenges, and it's been a multi-year challenge for us, is again being able to post information on evacuation routes, some of the flooding history signage, because it's that balance of, we want people to know, again, if they have to evacuate, where to go, how high the water mark had been for, again, the last critical storm. But we also know that realtors and residents are opposed to that signage, because it does act as a reminder that they're in a high risk area. So that's been an interesting challenge over the years of, how can we make sure people know how they have to get out safely, and kind of overcome some of those barriers for the blue sky days. I mentioned again the mitigation. So on the left, we have in South Norwalk, which is a multifamily, low moderate income area. You can see the first picture is a house, again, very simply elevated to, I think it was about maybe 2.5, 3 feet. And then what was in the neighborhood, again, some of those smaller family homes. And then on the right is, again, one of the more affluent areas in the town, where the house does actually go right up to the sidewalk, and you can essentially see what your neighbor is having for dinner on any given night, because the houses are so close to each other. But again, those houses and those homes were able to elevate on their own with no assistance or limitations. So you can see they elevated enough to put the garages underneath. So by elevating using your own money, you don't have the restrictions that FEMA puts on. So they were able to elevate probably about 8-9 feet higher than what was even needed. I did mention the survey, and I realize I'm going fast, and I apologize. So in 2019, I think late in the year, as a region, we wanted to start looking at, again, some of the long-term impacts on climate, and how the emergency managers, as well as fire, police, public works, EMS, and health were impacted, and what they see as gaps and shortfalls. And then the goal, and this was all kind of pre-COVID, was to be able to look at, what training can we bring into the community to help those, the first responders and the planners really start looking ahead a little bit more effectively and plan more efficiently, beyond just the all hazards approach. 14 communities in Region 1, we are the smallest but most population dense. 65 surveys were received. Again, top 3 issues of greatest concern were the changes in precipitation, hurricanes and sea level rise, and extreme temperature. So again, the extreme heat waves. The top 3 impacts on our operations were the increased needs for staffing. So when we do have storms, having to bring in additional resources, the increased need for community education and outreach, and then also the increased need for specialized equipment. Most towns may have one high water rescue vehicle or a Zodiac, but many, again, most do not. I think there's probably 4 high water rescue vehicles within the 14 towns along the coast. So it is a challenge. So either we have to request those resources from outside or put in a request to the state should that be needed during a storm. And then you just don't know if that resource will become available. So more and more, again, a lot of towns are looking at the, I'm going to say the military surplus program. So it allows us to access military vehicles, in our case, high water rescue vehicles, at a very low cost. So a nice recycling program, but we are seeing more communities on the coast look into that vehicle, the military vehicle program to get assets. And then the top 3 requests to meet their community needs really comes back to training. How do we help residents prepare? Training programs to help plan, and then how do we access the funding and resources for hazard mitigation? Because again, if you're not familiar with a lot of the hazard mitigation programs, it can be very challenging to navigate, as well as how do we help our residents navigate and understand all the intricacies of some of the mitigation programs and policies that are out there. A few additional toolkits and resources. One of my favorites is actually the Diversity Preparedness, which is out of Drexel University. You can actually browse by resources, hazards, and they have a lot in infographic form for residents that are may have literacy issues, as well as, again, they have so many languages and resources posted that you really can find a lot to meet very specific needs to help residents of all backgrounds prepare a little bit better. So if you've never been to that site, I definitely would encourage you to visit that one. It is a favorite. And then again, questions, comments, and thank you. Again, I know I went very quickly, but if you do have any questions, definitely feel free to email.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That really was a fantastic coverage of a lot of information. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm going to open it up to questions now, and we have a couple of already. So the first one I'm going to ask Nick, is there anything that has been surprising while you were working with DPH and CIRCA in developing the survey?
I think there's been a couple of surprising things for me as a student, just the wide range of what's going on with cooling centers and emergency shelters all over Connecticut, and also just the process of governmental work and how things are approved pretty much at every level, which takes some time to kind of let things become actual, like an actual survey being implemented. It took us approximately 12 weeks, I want to say, which for me as a student, just kind of going into it, I was just like ready to jump in and like by week 3, have it be out there. But there's a lot of things that need to be done and done correctly to make sure it works out in the end.
It's true. And it was, we were making sure we got everything right and covering all the bases, and definitely a shift in pace. Somebody did ask when the survey is completed, they asked how our report will be shared, and that will be, I'm not sure how DPH will be sharing it. They're going to be sharing it in one way, probably on their website and maybe in a newsletter, but CIRCA will definitely be sharing it via our website and a resilience roundup as well. So you can check out the results later, hopefully at the end of this year. There were a couple of things too from Michelle. You mentioned a couple of funding sources, and I just wanted to repeat those. Actually, military surplus the military surplus program was surprising, and that was interesting. And then you mentioned Flash.
Yes.
So,
So the military surplus program is, I want to say it's through DEEP, Department of Environmental Protection. I can double check that. So as a municipality, we would work directly through the state, and then the state works through the federal resources to get assets. Again, they are all pretty well used, well loved. So there again, nothing is brand new, and there are limits. So again, they really are kind of pretty much stripped down. And again, for the most part, municipalities, for like flooding resources, we really are looking at, again, the high water rescue vehicles. I believe sometimes they will have some boats, like Zodiac style boats. But for the most part, most of the municipalities that are looking for high water rescue vehicles will go through that program. Because again, for the most part, ideally, we are using them very infrequently. So it doesn't really pay to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a new vehicle when we can just get that. But again, I don't necessarily remember all the logistics, but most of the fire departments will work through the state to get access to those. And it does take a few months to actually get the resource and get it in hand. And my understanding is, I think most of the area, we would get ours from, I want to say, the Maryland or New Jersey area. So we drive down, get the resource, drive it back. Again, great program for municipalities that do need something like that. And you just have to justify why you would need it. And then the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, again, the acronym is FLASH. They have a fantastic hurricane campaign as well as a winter safety campaign. They worked with Epcot a few years ago on what was called, I think, like a Tale of Two Homes, storm struck. So they really are really front and center with some of the home mitigation programs to help residents, again, with some mitigation projects that aren't going to break the bank. Kids' activities, education, you name it. It's probably one of my favorite sites. I realize that makes me sound very much like a nerd, but I think the acronym or the website is www.flash.org. So pretty easy.
don't worry, I think you're in good company around here. So. Another question that that came up was, are communities using siren or auditory warnings for evacuation anymore? And if not, why aren't they?
For the most part, no. I think especially down here, I don't know of any that still have sirens. It's a mix of reasons. Partly, again, it's always the cost for maintaining those resources, as well as how far you can actually do the reach. So again, how far does that sound travel? What most people are finding, and again, in areas where you have again, the main threat is tornado. When people hear that tornado siren, they know what that means and they know what to do. For here, because again, it wouldn't be used that often. If we were to do a message where it's something that we actually are using, again, words. So you have to evacuate, such and such is happening. It's not always clear. People don't also always know what the sirens mean. So many times they'll then call 911 to find out why is the siren going off, which then floods the system. And the other challenge is you really tend to have the windows open in order to really hear the siren, or again, if there's a message. So now with so many homes having central air, central heat, not a lot of folks are actually keeping their windows open as much. So again, will that siren or those alarms actually make it through some of the homes? So it really is kind of almost an outdated system nowadays, when there is so much more technology that we're able to use, whether it's reverse notification, text, emails, social media, to get the message out. So definitely good in some areas where you just would know what the sound means. But again, for us, I think most people would automatically call 911 to find out what's happening.
Well, that's an interesting point, and that communication needs to shift with the way that people are responding to it. That's a good point. Well, there was a comment about incentivizing mitigation, and I think it ties into another question that somebody had. Michelle, if there's, I think this will be our last question too for time integrity, but if were there particular ordinances or zoning regulations that you've come across that towns should be looking for to either incentivize or de-incentivize preparedness?
That's a good question.
Maybe not de-incentivize preparedness, but de-incentivize things that inhibit preparedness.
Well, I think what we also see is, again, and I use the example of Rowayton, which is kind of that more affluent area in our city, where people are tending to build higher. So if their neighbor elevates, then that ruins somebody else's view. So then they also are going to elevate even higher the next time. And then it really is that idea of like, how big can you make the house on the parcel? I mean, ideally, I would love to be able to, and it may not be real, or it isn't realistic, be able to say, you know, there has to be a certain percentage of green on your parcel. You have to have some lawn soil.
Any company that wants to come to the meeting,
sorry, that can absorb some of the, in the flood area, you have to have some kind of landscaping to be able to absorb some of the water, especially when you're directly on the beach or again in that area. So what we're seeing is, again, some of these houses are literally built up right to the sidewalk. So in a perfect world, I would say, you know, allowing for a little bit more green space for a new building or renovation. So they have a little bit of natural buffer. That was a long answer, sorry.
No, that's interesting, and that ties into impervious surface, which is a strategy a lot of municipalities are looking at or trying to manage that through their MS4 permits, particularly the more dense communities, population dense communities. Thank you both. We're out of time, and I'm really appreciative to our presenters' time. I just want to let everybody know that you can find out more information about Resilient Connecticut at resilientconnecticut.uconn.edu or check out CIRCA at our website. And you can sign up for our roundup to be notified about when our survey results are in. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get a notification when our new videos are posted. So thank you again, Michelle and Nick, and we hope that everybody has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.